Hello, I am Kelly Lewis,
And I'm Tiffany Jones.
and we are your revenue insiders. Today we have Rob Cunningham from DocuSign. He is a sales leader, and we are going to talk about how you partner with your different levels of sales leadership as part of annual revenue planning. So let's jump in, Rob. Give us a little bit of your background. Let the listener kind of understand what you've done throughout your career.
Yeah, Kelly, thank you. And Tiffany, thank you for having me today. My career is 100% sales based. I've got about 24 years at this point in a sales capacity role, about 10 of which has been spent in leadership positions, both on frontline as well as second line leaders. With that, I have led teams in small to medium business, mid-market, majors, as well as enterprise. And I've led teams who focus on new logo acquisition as well as selling to our current customer and install base. So I would say I have run the gamut for the last 10 years in my leadership experience.
You've
I
done
would
it all.
I would add, Rob, and I feel like this gets left out. Being a parent is also like the same as being there's a lot of similarities. And like I know all of us here are parents, at least on this call right now. And so I think that counts too in those experiences.
Absolutely. I think keeping our children in line is a very key component, both in parenting as well as, of course, in leadership.
Have your kids picked up any of your sales skills? Do you see negotiation abilities coming through?
Unfortunately, yes. And I hate to admit it on this, but I typically lose to my children if that's a sign of how I do in this career.
I
Yeah, no, Rob's a few years ahead of us though, so that's what's coming for us. You're in the not teenagers yet,
I've
right?
got one teenager now and a 10-year-old. So any tips I can give you down the road, Tiffany, you give me a call. I will gladly help as best I can.
Yeah. I will keep you on speed dial for that and many reasons. Fine. We have been doing this annual planning series for a while. And of course, sales is the last one that we're talking through. Very classic for an annual planning conversation. But to recap thus far, we talked about what the need is from a project and program management, how you really execute with success in sales planning. We've talked to some cross-functional leaders around what that looks like from a services perspective, as well as a finance perspective. And I know from many years of annual planning, doing some of those alongside with Rob directly, that sales ends up being the tip of the spear and who you talk to. It's the very end of the process. What I'm really hoping we can do today is unpack how you pull them forward and how you think about sales is really an integrated part of the sales planning process. Because really what we've learned through all these conversations is that the more integrated you can be, the more successful your annual planning is going to be. So I've worked with you, Rob, as both a frontline leader and as a second line leader. So I've got to do that twice at DocuSign. I'd love to unpack how your perspective and your role as a leader has shifted between those two different positions.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, actually, and an interesting thought process from a sales leader. What I think a lot of people would expect me to say is, as a second line leader, you're way more engaged and way more involved in that planning process. I think that would be the natural way we would think about it. But interestingly enough, in my background in the two different roles, second line versus front line, obviously as a second line leader, you tend to think more strategically. And then as a frontline leader, you think about it more from a tactical perspective. So I would actually tell you, Tiffany, that I was way more engaged in the data analysis of sales planning, or I should say wanting to be more engaged. As you said, we're kind of the tip of the spear toward the end of the process. As a frontline leader, and then as a second line leader, obviously I care very much about the planning process, but I was thinking about it more broadly. So when the numbers get delivered down to say, here's what your targets are for the year based on our planning efforts, as a second line leader, I would think about things like, who are my business partners that are going to impact how I get to those numbers? What is marketing going to deliver? What is business development going to deliver? What are my MDR counterparts or XDR counterparts going to help with prospecting efforts to help us deliver on those commitments? What sort of education and enablement do my sales teams need in order to go deliver on those commitments? So thinking about it more broadly as a second line leader, but as a frontline leader, I was way more in the weeds. So I wanted to see the spreadsheets. I wanted to see the data and how those quotas and those targets were being sent. Because obviously we all know we have to drive toward those targets. It's growth at scale. When the targets are set, we've got to hit them. We have to find a path to do it. So as a frontline leader, I wanted to dig into the spreadsheets. I wanted to understand the backwards math from an AE's perspective. If I give them a territory, how are they actually going to get to their numbers, which drive the results that we all need? So I would say as a frontline leader, very tactical, very spreadsheet oriented, looking at average sales prices, looking at average deal cycles, looking at the territory itself and the expected penetration rates that you would want to see from within that territory. So very detail oriented frontline, and then tactical on the second line, which would be, again, how am I going to get to the broader number through business partners and education and enablement and those sorts of programs.
So, Rob, I also was a sales leader at one point in my career, but I've also been on the flip side of that where I was an enablement leader, revenue strategy leader. And so there's always this debate in annual planning on how early do we involve the frontline leaders? And the reason for that is you don't want to cause distraction at the end of your fiscal year. You want your reps and your frontline leaders focused on what they are trying to accomplish, getting those deals in the door, and you don't want to cause distractions. But I've also felt the pain of being a frontline leader. You walk into February 1, if that's the start of your fiscal, and you don't know what's coming and what's changing. And your team is pounding you with questions and you don't have the answers. And so I'm just curious, from your perspective, when is the right time to bring in the frontline sales leader? And conversations do you want to know about prior to the beginning of the fiscal year?
Yeah, Kelly, it's a tough question because there's a balancing act to everything you just referenced. And I couldn't agree more. Focus at the end of the year needs to be on closing and hitting the targets from the plan the previous year, of course. What I would probably say from my experience in the collaboration as to when I would want to be brought in, I'm not one that would sit there and ever say, I want to spend my time on the front end looking at it all. I want to focus on where my focus should be, which is on the account executives and the teams and how we're driving to the results. But I would say the best experience I've had is when I was brought in after the plan was set, but as the territories were starting to be put together. So I could then look at that data. And I think we can all admit oftentimes data is the key and critical part, but accuracy of that data is the key theme. And it was important for me to go in and actually review the territory data just to confirm that the numbers and the targets that the company was putting out that we were going to be expected to go hit is something that I felt we could go get based on the accuracy of the data. And the good experiences I've had have been when we've been able to go in and review the data, things have been set, and then make recommendations and have my counterparts in revenue operations or sales operations listen to the feedback, and if we needed to make adjustments, still make those small tweaks. Not a big tweak to the plan, but small tweaks to make sure we were set up for success. And I think a prime example in sales leadership, especially when we're talking about data, can be seen in duplicate accounts. Anyone who has a CRM knows the data in duplicate accounts or misaligned accounts in a territory.
Hierarchy?
Yeah, the hierarchies. That's a perfect call out, Kelly. Really important to have somebody really dig into that before the final plan is set. So that's where I would say I'm most effective is right at the end, but also we want to have a shot at it before that final rubber stamp is put down and the plan is over.
Let's call that like 85%, right?
Perfect.
Like bring me in at 85%, give me that wiggle room that I need, but don't get me too into the weeds.
We called it the paint by numbers phase.
I like that.
Where you've done all of like your lines and your assumptions, and then you've moved in with the sales leaders to your paint by numbers. Like where do you need, you've split Chicago in half because it's such a rich territory, and then your sales leader's like, whoa, like I told this guy, like he has these relationships with this account, and like he needs to own all of those. So you just go in and you make those tweaks at the individual level. Rob and I have had more than one conversation on like, you just gave him 100 of the same account. That's just 100 dupes in the system. And so he actually doesn't have any territory. Like back to the drawing board, please. Those are the most painful paint by numbers scenarios, I think. But yeah, 85% feels like the right barometer there.
I would agree. I feel like you're using time wisely at that point because it's your jobs to set the plans and get them in motion. And candidly, you don't want salespeople pushing back on the plan. You want us to be able to have confidence and go execute it. So that the sooner you bring us in, the more chance we have to push back on something that we
Yes.
shouldn't push back on. We need
The
to be excited.
confidence, yeah, the confidence is so much of the success and like how you get from A to Z in a planning process, like to the actual execution. So speaking of that, like Rob, a lot of what you just described is you really become an either first or second line manager. Like you're acting as the bridge from what the spreadsheet world that I often live in, or Kelly has as well, into execution. And we talked to Sarah Bedwell earlier this year in one of our prior episodes, and she talked a lot about like how you think like a CEO. And a lot of what you're describing fits really well into the thought processes that she walked us through. But I'd love to hear from you. How do you think about planning backwards so your team is successful? You mentioned a few things about like the activities they need to take, but like what's the key things that are important for you there?
Yeah, I describe that as the territory planning phase,
Mm.
Tiffany. So as we go into territory planning, it's really important for both the sales leaders as well as, of course, the individual contributors, the account executives, to understand how they can get to their quotas and what the expectations are from start to finish to get to said number. So one of the things that you're going to look at very closely as a sales leader and coach your account executives on is break down your territory. Get an understanding of what are your tier one accounts? What are your tier two accounts? Which are the ones that are going to move the needle the most and why? And so you can look at a variety of different data points. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago as well, average sales price. You're going to look at average time to close the deal. You're going to look at number of accounts within the territory, the penetration rates of how many accounts do you actually need to do a deal with every quarter, every 6 months, whatever that time frame might be, to do that backwards math into your quota. And obviously another key component of that is the front end in terms of the pipeline generation efforts. But how much pipeline do I need to generate every single week, every single month, every single quarter in order to continuously and with confidence hit the quotas that are set? So it really becomes a backwards math game, I guess is the way I would describe it, is take your quota and then break down the territory for all of those different data points and understand how much activity do I need to do as a seller in order to go get the number. And that's the way I would tend to coach on that and break down the territory.
Yeah, that backwards math is so powerful. And I often find, obviously, Rob, you've been doing this for years. So you know how to do that backwards math. That's just naturally something you do. I would call out if you're a new sales leader, this is the first time you're doing this, make sure you partner with your ops team to teach them how to do this correctly, because it's a huge miss if you're not doing the backwards math and really understanding how you get to where you need to go.
Well, and even thinking about back to earlier in our series, we talked a lot about being like customer centric and thinking about your ICPs and being aligned. And so even in those conversations, like when you talk about the prioritization of those activities, Rob, like I think leaning back on your RevOps, sales ops counterparts, like what were the assumptions that went into the plan? So you know, like, oh my, like you have that grounding in what is the ICP changing or the expectations, like a certain level within your territory is what's going to be richest based on features. Tanya talked to us about like being, product being really oriented and customer first. And so I do think like even when you're as experienced as you are, like making sure you keep that in the back of your mind, like that you need to validate and still do that circular validation that like the backwards math you're planning locks into the assumptions that everyone made and there's not a gap there. And so you don't get halfway through the year and like your backwards math is failing you and like the execution's not working.
Yeah, it's interesting, Kelly. I like the point, obviously, you brought up, and then Tiffany, your follow-up to that, because I'd mentioned earlier, as a second line leader, one of the big things you focus in on is who are my business partners that will influence
Right.
the ability to get to the number. And I'm definitely remiss in not mentioning I have weekly meetings with my revenue operations counterparts. It is so important to dig into the ICPs and the data around how we're tracking, literally broken down to a daily basis within a quarter of where are we and what do we need to do to either add more or tweak to make sure we get to the number. So you're spot on. I think having those regular check-ins with your operations folks is a critical part to sales leadership.
One fun part about starting the new year is it's always, as a sales leader, what have you done for me lately? You might have blown your number out last year, but you've got this new target and it's usually higher than it was the previous year. Very rarely does the target go down. And so as a sales leader, you're focused and have to think about how you reset expectations with your team, both from performance as well as accountability. So how do you think about having those conversations with your team in terms of comp, activity, overall expectation setting at the beginning of the year?
Yeah, I think performance management is one of the most important things that a sales leader does. And I think the term can be a little scary because a lot of people think of performance management as I'm moving somebody out of the business. I actually view it quite opposite. Performance management is how we execute at a very high level. And so for me, it's candidly why I love this career path. Sales is very black and white. There is no gray area in the way I view sales. You either hit or you don't. 99% may be something we celebrate. It's a good effort, but it's a miss. There is no gray area on that. Anything that we want from an expectation standpoint should be at 100% or above. So I try to set that expectation every week, every month, every quarter is what are we doing every single week to make sure we are driving to that 100% plus number. And with that, it just comes down to having a weekly cadence with teams so they have a very clear visual as to how they're tracking, what else they need to do, where they need to spend time and focus, those ICPs that Tiffany mentioned earlier. We've got to be tracking toward those data points to make sure that we're hitting those numbers. And then as long as the team has the same belief that I do, which is a miss is a miss and a hit is a hit, then we're marching toward the same goal, which is to obviously hit. But I'm a very data-driven, focused leader in that regard. If we just tell somebody, go do this, and we don't have any follow-up or any coaching or any metrics around it, then we're unfortunately setting our reps up to fail. We've got to be hand in hand with giving them guidance on what you need to do to be successful, broken down from a data point perspective. And you can measure that very clearly through a variety of factors: number of phone calls made, number of messages sent, number of meetings per week, how much pipeline are you generating, both as an individual contributor as well as a combination with your XDR marketing partners. A variety of data points you want to look at to drive that expectation of being over the 100% mark. But that's the way I set the expectations early in the year and then track it week over week.
Love the week over week mentality there, because it's so important to be on top of it and not wait for your quarter to hit and like, oh, you were at like, even if it's 90%, we want to celebrate. Like, you missed the opportunity and like those like moments to like really start tweaking what's working and not working each week to like ensure you can get to that 100% number or whatever the timing cohort is that you're tracking towards. I also think one of the major flops that I see in planning is, especially in my role, we look at planning as this like instance. It's this like activity of time that like sucks a lot of energy out. Like, you run it for a little over a quarter and then planning is over. But the reality is like your execution has just started and you're living the results of that and doing those weekly iterations. And I've been through with you, Rob, a mid-year replan before. I'm sure a lot of people have been through those activities. When you talk about those weekly meetings you have with RevOps, how are you raising, like when you're managing your team on a weekly basis, how are you raising concerns where the plan is just falling flat after you're in that execution phase?
Yeah, I would love to say I've never been in that situation, but I would not be telling the truth if that was the case. I think that honesty in how I interact with my own team of account executives, I'm failing them if I'm not giving them truthful and honest feedback about how they're performing and where they should be improving. And I think my answer to that would be I have to have that same expectation in honest collaborative conversations with my business partners, revenue operations in your case, Tiffany, to say, we have a miss and there's a problem that we need to address. And from a sales leader's perspective, if the issue is the expectations at the beginning of the year were so far out of range, we're not going to get to it. We need to have that conversation because from my seat, I look at it as I have a bunch of talented sellers that were driving really hard to hit results. And their goals are more oftentimes than not to, one, make money. They're in sales.
Yep.
But two, their idea of career growth and progression from one level to the next, or even into a leadership role, it can be stumped if they have a miss. And even if the company says, boy, we had a miss in our planning, this is going to be a hard number to get to, that's still a miss for the seller in their career path. And so it's really important to have honest dialogues with your business partners in your roles, Tiffany, to say, there's a problem. How can we adjust? What should we do? Can we sponsor a spiff to help move things faster and make life easier for the sellers? Things like that. You've just got to be collaborative to fix things if there is a problem mid-year. Everyone has to be open to that dialogue with honest and truthful feedback.
Yeah, I love that. Like continuing to be collaborative even after the planning phase is over, like is one of the keys to success for sure.
Okay. It is that point in our episode where we talk about point of view and creating your point of view. Rob, for our listener, if they're thinking about how they head into this next year and how they work with their sales leaders, what questions should they be asking themselves to create their point of view?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think from my perspective, just based on my commentary of sales being black and white earlier, I think the question that I would emphasize is, what does good execution look like? And are your sales leaders that you're partnering with as you roll out the plan aligned coming out of that planning session? So there's no surprises across the board and everyone is marching to the same drum to get to the same goal at the end of the next fiscal year.
Perfect. That's a great question.
Yeah. Definitely timely. I'm going to go take that back and think about it as I have the rest of my wrap-up planning meetings before the holidays this week. Well, thank you so much, Rob, for joining us today. It was great to get your expertise. It's so varied. And although I'm not currently working directly with you, I always enjoyed our time together. So I know that you really know your stuff in this arena. And so I really appreciate you chatting with both of us and sharing that thought leadership with everyone.
I appreciate the invite and thank you so much.
Espresso martinis on the Revenue Insiders coming next.
Thank you for tuning in to the Revenue Insiders. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a minute to leave us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners. Thank you.